Okay, so welcome back. So it's time to have another talk. And the next speaker is Christian. Christian is an associate professor at the IT University of Copenhagen and Uppsala University. So his research is at the intersection of NLP, machine translation, translation studies, and text linguistics. So he is particularly interested in referring expressions such as pronouns and lexical noun phrases. Today, he will give us a talk understanding pronouns in translation, resources, methods, challenges, and insights. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Gumbo. Thank you all again for being back here. As you've probably realized, this workshop has been organized in the framework of a project that I have been working on for the last couple of years. It's funded by the Swedish Research Council, and I originally applied for it in 2017 after several failed attempts the years before. So when I originally wrote that project, NLP was actually pretty new, and many things were a bit different from what there's been an enormous development since then. So the project was submitted together with Bonnie Weber from the University of Edinburgh, and it mostly provided funding for my own position in Uppsala, but there's been a couple of important changes in the project plan. So in 2019 and 2020, I actually spent 1.5 years that due to COVID then became 2 years in Edinburgh. And in 2021, I got this new job in Copenhagen, which had the effect that I had to reduce my activity in the project quite a lot. And this had a very positive effect in that Gombo was then able to join the project as a postdoc and do a lot of exciting work that I probably couldn't have done on my own. So the project has 3 steps. It started with a corpus study and investigation of pronouns in translation, and this is what I'm mostly going to talk about in my talk today. The second and third steps were then actual models for pronouns in cross-lingual contexts and in translation, and this will be the topic of Gongbo's talk after mine, because he has more recently spent a lot of time on these questions. So let me start by looking at the problem of pronoun translation, as it is very often seen, and as I also tended to see it at least a couple of years ago before I started this project. So the prototypical case of pronoun translation is that of an anaphoric pronoun in one language, so the pronoun it that we have up here, which is an anaphora to some other noun phrase called the antecedent, which typically occurs in the previous sentence or possibly in the same sentence. And when we translate this into another language, then depending on differences in the grammatical systems of the 2 languages, we may have to add information in the other language that we didn't have in the source language. So for instance, by translating from English into French, in French, pronouns are marked for gender and number, whereas in English, they are marked for number and animacy to some extent, but not for grammatical gender. So in this case here, we would need to figure out what the grammatical gender of the translation of the antecedent is, and then we would have to choose the correct pronoun in the correct translation of the pronoun, which will be different depending on the specific words that was chosen here. So this is the prototypical case of pronoun translation, and it's also like a case that occurs relatively frequently, so by no means rare, but it's also by no means the only thing that can happen to pronouns in translation. And I'm going to structure my talk loosely around some common assumptions about pronoun translations that have been made or are being made, or that I have made also at different points in my career. So one common assumption is that the antecedent of a referring pronoun is another noun phrase in the text, and that is what we saw on the previous slide, where the pronoun it referred to some noun phrase containing the word version, And then basically when we want to translate this pronoun, we have to find this other noun phrase and translate it and use its properties in order to predict the correct pronoun. There are several counterexamples. A trivial counterexample for this is that of pleonastic pronouns, but I think it's a tragedy where one of them doesn't see the other, or as an even more typical example of a pleonastic pronoun in the sentence, it rains, the word it. So these pronouns are also relatively frequently, they fill an empty subject slot in a sentence, but they don't really refer to anything at all. So it's no use looking for a noun phrase that this might refer to. Another thing that I have become interested more recently is that of non-nominal reference. So pronouns that do refer to something, but they don't refer to something expressed by a noun phrase. As in this example here, there's so much more information about you, and that's an important thing, where that refers to the fact that there is so much more information about you, but not to the word information or something like that. So this has motivated work on evaluation of different pronoun functions and on the annotations of non-nominal coreference. And the most important thing that I would like to talk about here, which has actually made up a very large part of the activity in my research project, is the annotation and creation of the corpus ParCorFull. ParCorFull is a multilingual parallel corpus with rich annotations of coreference. So it's a corpus that contains the same text in several languages, and in each of these languages it is manually annotated for coreference according to a broad definition of the word coreference. And what sets it apart from other existing resources is, on the one hand, that it is multilingual and parallel, which is not very typical of coreference annotated corpora, and on the other hand, that we have used a broader coverage of coreference phenomena compared to some other previously existing corpora. The predecessor of ParCorFull was another corpus called ParCor that we created in 2014 for the languages English, German, and French. It contained 11 TED Talks and 8 documents from the EU bookshop from the European Union. And ParCor only contained annotations of pronouns and their direct antecedents. So that's when we, at that time, were interested in the translation of pronouns and believed that all you need is to know what a pronoun refers to. Now in ParCorFull, we extended this quite substantially in terms of scope of annotation, in that we include not only pronouns and the things they immediately refer to, but we include full coreference chains, including both nominal and non-nominal coreference. We also extended the contents of the corpora bit. So we added another 9 TED Talks and in addition some news data. And in the first release, ParCorFull covered the languages English and German. And now this year we are releasing the second version of the corpus ParCorFull, which is roughly equivalent in scope to ParCorFull 1, but it now covers 4 European languages: English, German, French, and Portuguese. With not exactly parallel text similar languages, but mostly parallel documents. So there are parallel data, parallel documents across all of those languages. The coreference annotation in ParCorFull contains anaphoric noun phrases. It includes split antecedents here, which means that when a pronoun refers to something that is expressed not just in one noun phrase, but for instance, a whole list of noun phrases, or like my brother lives in America and my sister lives in Europe. I like them very much, where them would refer to my brother and my sister, even though they occur in separate sentences. It does not include singleton chains, which means noun phrases that don't refer that don't have any coreference elements in the text. So this is also an important distinction to make across certain coreference annotated corpora, and this is something we have not chosen to include. It does include extra textual reference. It includes substitution and ellipsis. It includes temporal and local adverbs. So in the 1920s, then, which is not technically a pronoun, but has a similar function here, as it includes something that we call event reference. This is a fairly broad category of things that are mostly expressed by verb phrases, but actually in our corpus, it's very broadly defined, because in the original ParCor corpus, this was actually a catch-all category, because we were mostly interested in nominal coreference. We had a category for everything that was not nominal. And since then, we've become more interested in actually coding this more finely. So now the category includes verb phrases, clauses, part of the discourse, and so on. So like here, democracy is in trouble, no question about that. Or our mission is to organize the world's information and make it accessible. Is that really what you guys are still doing? Or here, and I thought, why can't we do that today? And that's how this project got going. Another common assumption is that translating a pronoun requires generating a matching pronoun in the target language. And there are also many counterexamples to that, because this is simply not always what happens in translation. So the example that I have here, but the thing about tryptamines is that they can't be taken orally, because they are denatured by an enzyme in the human gut. If you look at the human French reference translation of this, it says, par contre, les tryptamines ne peuvent pas être consommés par voie orale. So tryptamines cannot be consumed orally. And the thing is here, the thing is that this construction, the thing about something doesn't really exist in French. And if you do away with this, the French simply says, instead of, but the thing about tryptamines is, it says, but tryptamines can't be consumed orally. There's a good reason for that, but the effect of this is that the pronoun they simply disappears in the translation. And there's a second pronoun they that also disappears in the same translation, because the French translator opted for infinite construction here. It's basically translating this as, instead of because they're denatured, translating it as being denatured, which sounds more natural in French than perhaps it does in English. So recognizing and categorizing non-literal translation patterns has also been a large part of the work that I've done here. And the way we've done this is by matching coreference chains across languages, both in manually annotated data in the ParCorFull corpus, but also more automatically in large unannotated corpora, and by matching coreference annotations across languages and finding what we variously call incongruities or discrepancies between the coreference chains in the source and in the target language in order to uncover interesting differences here. The typical alignment methodology here is that you run some sort of automatic word alignment, GISA++, or sometimes we also use Torvald Östling's Admiral aligner. Then somehow you have to match the chains based on the word alignments, find out which chain corresponds to which one. And then you find mismatches in the chains. The exact details of the methodology vary a bit across the different studies that we've done. But one thing that we've looked at repeatedly is finding unaligned words that occur in a chain, and then figuring out whether or not these correspond to something that occurs in a chain in the other language. And there are various reasons why you find those disparities between source and target coreference chains. So on the more interesting side, perhaps, we have the phenomena of explicitation and implicitation, where the referring expressions on the source and on the target side are different because there is an actual difference in content between the source and the target, and because one language has more information than the other. This is something that relatively frequently happens in translation, and there's been a lot of theoretical literature in translation studies about why this might happen in various cases. So one example that I have here is, so I have this English and French text, and both of them are actually translations of the same Czech original that I don't have here because I couldn't find it. But both of these are from a WMT data set and have been translated from Czech. And it's about a French bank, Société Générale, which owns a Czech bank. And In the English translation, it says the French banking giant Société Générale, the owner of the local Komerční banka, Commerce Bank, where you can see that in the Czech original, it said the local Komerční banka because Komerční banka is a Czech bank, but then they translate the Czech name of the bank because this is not obvious to English readers, and they mention that Société Générale is a French banking giant. The French translator went another way. He says Le géant français Société Générale, without saying that this is a banking giant, because the French-speaking audience can be assumed to know that. On the other hand, what they did here is they wrote propriétaire de la banque tchèque Komerční banka. So they translated the local Komerční banka into the Czech Komerční banka, because for a French reader, this isn't necessarily local. So information has been added here. On the other hand, they do not translate the words Komerční banka for whatever reason. But these are typical, like in this case, culturally determined instances of explicitation from the Czech original. Another reason for why coreference chains can be different across languages that often actually overlaps with explicitation or implicitation is the accommodation of systemic language differences. So if you have differences in the grammatical systems of the languages, then sometimes you need to add information. And in the translation studies literature, in fact, this is often analyzed as what they call obligatory explicitation. It's obligatory because the grammatical system forces you to do it. You can't get away without it, without becoming ungrammatical. So those are things you have in common with your parents and with your children. Translating this into German, Dinge, die sie mit ihren Eltern und Kindern gemein haben. In English, you can have this zero relative pronoun. You can have a relative clause that is does not actually have an overt relative pronoun if it's a subject. In German, you can't, and therefore you get another pronoun here that you don't have in English. But there are also differences in the linguistic preferences of the languages, as in this translation down here, where a reaction to the medication the clinic gave me for my depression left me suicidal. This is perfectly idiomatic in French, and you could translate this literally into German and still be grammatical, but it would not be idiomatic at all. As you can see, when you feed this into a machine translation system, some empty systems actually give you a literal translation that sounds really weird. And there are various reasons for that. One of the reasons is that this anthropomorphization of the clinic here just works in English, but it doesn't really work in German. So the clinic giving you a medication. In German, clinics don't give you medications, doctors do. So this sounds really odd in German. And also this left me suicidal, which one empty system translates as hat mich selbstmörderisch gemacht, which technically expresses the same meaning, but just sounds really, really odd in German. Führten bei mir zu Selbstmordgedanken. So created suicidal thoughts in me is much more natural in German. So these are just preferences that the two languages have. And in order to get this right and naturally sounding, you need to rephrase the sentence a little bit. And that can lead to differences in the coreference chains. But other things, other differences in the chain actually don't come from real differences between the source and the target. So one thing that we noticed when we annotated this multilingual data is that very often there are actual genuine ambiguities and vaguenesses in this language. And when you annotate this and annotate the coreference chains in this corpus, you have to disambiguate this because you have to decide what something refers to. And sometimes you have a genuine choice here. Then what can happen is that the annotators in the source and in the target language simply make different, perfectly reasonable choices. We can create a global parliament of mayors. That's an idea where the that can either refer to a global parliament of mayors, or it can refer to the whole idea of creating a global parliament of mayors. And both of those interpretations are plausible, and there's nothing in the text to actually disambiguate them. This is a slightly more complicated example here, where again with the word this, and I think there's a this missing up here. Lots of people talk about this, and what this is that is being talked about could be either the collection of the data, or it could be the revolution in medicine that might happen later on. And it's simply, the text doesn't really say both of those, and interpretations are plausible. And you can, to some extent, you can try to get a grip on this using very fine-grained guidelines for annotation. But sometimes it's really difficult, because there are actually several plausible readings of a sentence, and one or the other might be more plausible. Finally, what also happens quite a lot is that you get simple annotation errors. Unfortunately, even though we do a lot of quality control in the annotation, we still have errors in our corpora, and those cause discrepancies in the chains. There are also errors in the word alignment between the languages, and one of the problems here is one that we've already discussed at this workshop today. A statistical word alignment is a linguistically ill-defined task. We don't even know exactly what is supposed to be aligned here. So it's a bit difficult to know what exactly could be expected. Or another variant of annotation errors is where the annotators don't really make errors in that sense, but interpret the guidelines inconsistently across languages. And this is something you should obviously be able to read out using better training, but it's difficult to do so if you do this in different languages and at different points in time. And just to explain why we still get a lot of errors here is that I think a large part of the problem here is visualization. So when we annotate those parallel corpora, what we see here is for each of the languages, we have a window like this over here, where you see the text and the coreference chains in the text. And you can always highlight one coreference chain at a time in one language. And then you have another language where you annotate another coreference chain. And you can see the properties of one markable in a separate window, but you can't see the properties of all the markables at the same time, and you can't see all the chains at the same time, and you can't see the word alignment at all, because the source and the target side are completely different. And it's very easy to miss inconsistencies even in one language, even if working carefully, and the word alignment isn't even there. And I think in order to get this to do this better, we would need probably a different software, but it's difficult because it's a multi-dimensional visualization problem. So I don't even have a good idea of how we should visualize this in order to make it better. But clearly the fact that you don't see, that at any point in time you don't see most of the information doesn't help to actually get it right. So the lessons learned here is that the parallel corpus with rich coreference annotation is a very valuable resource, but it's difficult to achieve consistent annotation quality, especially if you do this over a long time. And what we would need is better corpus visualization, word alignment with the proper linguistic foundations, and a lot of resources for continuous quality checks and annotator training. And we spent quite a lot of effort training annotators, but the thing is you would need to retrain them and retest them after half a year and after a year and so on, if this goes on for a long time, because otherwise knowledge gets lost and people get out of practice and things diverge again. And this takes a lot of resources. So finally, the third assumption that I would like to discuss is that referring pronouns agree in gender and number with their antecedent. And the counterexample here is what is called notional concord. So this example here. So I think DeepMind, what's really amazing about DeepMind is that it can actually, they're learning things in this unsupervised way. So here, even in one sentence, we have a singular plural pronoun and the plural pronoun referring to the same entity, DeepMind here. Because in English, it's possible to refer to collective nouns such as company names with singular or plural, depending on how you conceptualize them. So what we've done here is we studied linguistic preferences across languages and genres with the help of studies with humans. And the question that we asked here is, how do the production and interpretation of referring expressions vary across languages? We run a human production studies about referring back to organizational named entities, where we presented participants with prompts like these. Last week, Intel announced the shutdown of the factory in the press release, and then we asked participants to provide a continuation of the sentence here. And the prompts were designed in such a way that we hope that they would produce another reference to the named entity that we have here. And we distinguished four types of four different types of referring expressions: repetitions of the name here, so if they say Intel again, or paraphrastic noun phrases if they say something like the company or something like that, and pronouns which could be in singular or in plural, so it or they in English. And if we run this across 5 different European languages, here's some results for 3 of them on the distribution between lexical noun phrases, so repetitions of the name, or paraphrastic noun phrase as opposed to pronouns. And what you can see is that linguistic preferences vary significantly across languages. So in English, we get 75% pronouns, 25% lexical NPs. In German, we get over 80% lexical NPs and only 60% pronouns. French is somewhere in between. And these are, it's not because you can't say things with a pronoun in German, but simply people don't seem to do it the same way. And that means that if we have a translation system that wants to conform to the target language norms, then it should obviously follow the conventions of the target language. If you look at singular versus plural conceptualization, we also see significant differences across languages. And we also see differences across different types of entities. So we tested music bands, companies, and sports teams. And in most languages, companies have significantly higher rates of singular conceptualization than bands and sport teams. And as you can see across languages, in German and English, generally plural is a lot more common, whereas in French is again a bit in the middle. In Italian and Spanish, singular is way more common, except for the exception of Italian bands here, which has a specific reason, because with Italian bands you're required to use a plural definite article, which then obviously triggers plural agreement. So again, we have significantly different conventions across languages. We ran 2 different studies in this style, one of them with constructed stimuli, where we basically made up those prompt sentences by ourselves, and the other one where we tried to use corpora. So we extracted candidate sentences from corpora and simplified them a bit and used those. And this gives us 2 studies that are very similar but have slightly different prompt material. So you can see here is, this is a sentence that we find in a corpus here, and this is the thing that we showed to the participants. It's very, very lightly edited. We just shortened it a little bit, because usually the corpus sentences are a bit too complicated. But so we simplified them a little bit and we came up with a prompt. But otherwise, it's basically the same as we had before. And in the results, what you can see is that this is for English only. So in the constructed examples, we get an overwhelming majority of they continuation. People hardly ever use anything else, really. Whereas in the corpus studies, we get significantly more nouns and names. We still get a lot of they, really, but we do get statistically significantly more nouns, names, and it, which sorts of suggests that there are effects of domain and genre and register potentially here. Potentially also as modality, because we found evidence that people seem to interpret the prompts that they are given as a sort of oral exercise, even though it is in writing. And if you compare this to a similar study that we did on the ontonotes corpus, so this is a corpus, a large corpus that is annotated for coreference, and we could use the coreference annotation to extract similar cases, similar examples from the corpus. And you can see that in the written text in this corpus, we have significantly less, very, very significantly less they continuations here, and a lot more repetitions of the names. So this really seems to be, there really seems to be a very strong effect of the modality of how you collect this information. Inside the ontonotes corpus, we noticed that the proportion of they is much, much higher in oral-oriented text. So BC is the broadcast conversation subcorpus of ontonotes, and TC is telephone conversations, and they have a lot more they compared to the more written genres. To conclude, good pronoun translation is a lot more complex than just enforcing gender agreement, and referring expressions differ significantly across languages, and good translation should respect those different conventions. Genre register of modality also has strong effects here, but the annotation and exploration of these phenomena is made difficult by a lack of tools to show this properly. We have created the ParCorFull corpus, which is in the second version, covers 5 European languages and can be used to study these phenomena or construct test suites. And with this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much, and sorry for running over time a bit.